If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1: Inheritance of Power and Early Cruelties. Part 1: Birth in Blood. The childhood shaped by dynastic violence. A palace should be a safe place for a child, but for young Akbar, it became a battlefield where family members killed each other for power. Born in 1542, while his father Humayun wandered in exile, Akbar entered a world where violence decided who lived and who ruled. His grandfather Babur had founded the Mughal Empire through conquest, but keeping it required constant bloodshed. The boy grew up hearing stories that would haunt most children. His own uncles had tried to murder his father multiple times. Kamran Mirza, Humayun's brother, had poisoned their father's mind against him and stolen his throne. When Humayun finally returned to reclaim his empire, he showed no mercy. Akbar watched as his father ordered the execution of nobles who had betrayed him. He saw heads displayed on palace walls as warnings to others. The violence reached into every corner of Akbar's childhood. His wet nurse told him bedtime stories about kings who killed their brothers. Palace guards whispered about princes who died mysteriously in the night. Trust became a luxury no Mughal prince could afford. Every smile could hide a dagger. Every gift might contain poison. When Humayun died falling downstairs in 1556, 13-year-old Akbar inherited more than an empire. He inherited centuries of family hatred and betrayal. His regent, Bahram Khan, immediately began eliminating potential threats. Akbar watched as distant cousins disappeared, their bodies found floating in rivers or buried in unmarked graves. This was not cruelty for pleasure, but survival strategy passed down through generations. The young emperor learned that mercy often meant death. His great-grandfather had spared enemies who later returned to fight him. His grandfather had shown kindness to rebels who repaid it with rebellion. His father had trusted brothers who stabbed him in the back. Each generation paid the price for compassion with blood and lost battles. These early experiences shaped Akbar's understanding of power. He learned that fear commanded respect more effectively than love. Violence prevented larger violence. A quick execution today could prevent a civil war tomorrow. The child who should have played with toys instead studied the art of elimination. By age 16, Akbar had witnessed enough betrayals to fill several lifetimes. He understood that his throne sat on a foundation of bones, many belonging to his own relatives. This knowledge would guide his decisions for the next 50 years. The brutal education of his youth created a ruler who would use any means necessary to protect his empire, viewing mercy as weakness and hesitation as invitation for rebellion. The boy shaped by dynastic violence was ready to seize full control and eliminate anyone who dared challenge his authority. Part 2: Seizing the Throne. Akbar's ruthless rise to power. When 13-year-old Akbar claimed the Mughal throne in 1556, he faced a deadly puzzle. His father Humayun had died from a simple fall down library stairs, leaving behind an empire drowning in chaos. Enemies surrounded the young emperor from every direction. Afghan warlords controlled much of northern India. Rival claimants to the throne gathered armies. Even within his own court, ambitious nobles whispered of replacing the boy with someone more manageable. The real power belonged to Bahram Khan, Akbar's regent and guardian. This seasoned warrior had served 3 generations of Mughal emperors and understood that mercy meant death. He moved swiftly to eliminate threats before they could grow. When Afghan leader Hemu marched toward Delhi with a massive army, claiming the title of emperor, Bahram Khan knew this moment would decide everything. The Battle of Panipat in November 1556 became Akbar's baptism in blood. Though barely old enough to hold a sword properly, the young emperor watched as his forces clashed with Hemu's war elephants and seasoned troops. An arrow struck Hemu in the eye during the fighting, and his unconscious body was dragged before Akbar. Bahram Khan urged the boy to execute his rival personally, to send a message throughout the land. Akbar hesitated for a moment, then drove his blade into the fallen warrior. This single act announced his willingness to kill without mercy. Hemu's head was displayed publicly while his supporters were hunted down and executed. The message rang clear across northern India: challenge this boy emperor and die. But external enemies were only part of the threat. Inside the royal court, nobles plotted constantly. Some questioned whether a teenager could truly rule the vast Mughal domains. Others saw opportunity in the chaos, believing they could manipulate or replace Akbar entirely. Each suspected betrayal prompted swift retaliation. Bahram Khan maintained lists of potential traitors, updating them daily based on court gossip and intercepted messages. Suspected conspirators simply vanished during the night. Their families received no explanations, only warnings. The imperial palace became a place where walls had ears, and friendship could mean execution. As Akbar matured, he learned to read faces and voices for signs of deception. He discovered that fear worked better than love in maintaining loyalty. Generous rewards for faithful service came paired with terrible punishments for betrayal. The young emperor, who had once hesitated before killing Hemu, now moved decisively against any perceived threat. By age 16, Akbar had consolidated his grip on power through calculated brutality. He had eliminated immediate rivals, crushed rebellious nobles, and established a network of spies throughout his territories. The foundation of his empire rested on the bones of those who had dared oppose him. This early period of ruthless consolidation would shape his entire approach to governance, creating an emperor who viewed every subject as either a useful tool or a potential enemy requiring elimination. Part 3. Suppressing Rivals, the Crushing of Dissent and Betrayal. The foundation built on bones and brutality demanded constant maintenance, and Akbar understood this truth better than anyone. By his 17th year, the young emperor had learned that mercy was a luxury he could not afford. Every noble who bowed before him might harbor dreams of rebellion. Every courtier who praised his wisdom might be plotting his downfall. Akbar's approach to potential rivals became methodical and merciless. He established a network of informants that reached into every corner of his empire. Servants whispered secrets, wives betrayed husbands, children reported on their fathers. This web of surveillance created an atmosphere where no one felt safe from imperial scrutiny. When whispers reached Akbar's ears about a group of nobles planning to replace him with his half-brother, he struck swiftly. The alleged conspirators were arrested in the dead of night. Some faced immediate execution. Others endured prolonged imprisonment in dark dungeons beneath the palace walls. The half-brother in question simply disappeared, his fate becoming another palace mystery that none dared investigate. The emperor's paranoia extended beyond blood relatives to anyone who commanded respect or loyalty. Military commanders who won too many battles found themselves reassigned to distant posts or stripped of their armies. Religious leaders who attracted large followings received visits from imperial agents. Wealthy merchants who grew too influential discovered their trade routes suddenly blocked by new regulations. Akbar perfected the art of turning allies against each other. He would share selective information with different nobles, then watch to see which version reached his enemies. Those who failed this test faced swift retribution. He promoted rivals to the same positions, forcing them to compete desperately for his favor while destroying each other's credibility. The emperor's methods grew increasingly sophisticated. Public executions served as warnings, but private disappearances proved more effective at spreading fear. A nobleman might attend court one day and simply never return home. His family would receive no explanation. His property would quietly transfer to imperial control. His name would fade from official records as if he had never existed. Even those closest to Akbar lived in constant uncertainty. Court favorites who felt secure in their positions would suddenly find themselves accused of disloyalty. The evidence might be fabricated, but the consequences remain deadly real. This unpredictability served Akbar's purposes perfectly, ensuring that no one ever felt safe enough to plan serious opposition. The systematic crushing of dissent created a court atmosphere thick with tension and mistrust. Nobles smiled at each other while secretly reporting suspicious behavior to imperial spies. Former friends became rivals. Brothers turned against brothers. The emperor's paranoia had infected his entire administration, creating a system where survival depended on absolute loyalty to one man. This reign of fear would soon face its greatest test as vassal states began questioning whether submission to such tyranny was worth their continued existence. Part 4. The Vassal Rebellions, Treachery and Punishment in Early Rule. The atmosphere of fear that Akbar had carefully crafted within his court soon spread beyond the palace walls, reaching the vassal states and regional nobles who had once enjoyed relative independence. These rulers, watching the systematic destruction of dissent in the imperial capital, began to question whether their continued submission was sustainable. The young emperor's paranoid control had created an unintended consequence. It pushed formerly loyal vassals toward open rebellion. The first major uprising came from the Rajput kingdoms of Rajasthan, where proud warrior chiefs had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Akbar's demands for absolute submission. These rulers had maintained their ancestral lands for centuries, and the thought of bowing completely to a paranoid teenager felt like betrayal of their forefathers. The Rana of Mewar, Maharana Pratap's father, sent word that traditional tribute would continue, but total surrender was impossible. Other Rajput chiefs quietly supported this position, creating a network of potential rebellion. Akbar's response was swift and brutal. Rather than negotiating, he dispatched his most ruthless generals with clear instructions: complete submission or total destruction. The military campaigns that followed revealed the emperor's willingness to employ terror as a political tool. Villages that supported rebel nobles were burned. Entire families of resistant leaders disappeared during night raids. Captured rebels faced public executions designed to send messages to other potential dissidents. The siege of Chittorgarh became a defining moment of this period. When the fortress refused to surrender, Akbar ordered a massacre that lasted 3 days. Historians estimate that over 30,000 people died, including women and children who had sought refuge within the fort's walls. The emperor personally supervised parts of the slaughter, demonstrating that his cruelty extended far beyond palace politics. This wasn't just military strategy, it was deliberate psychological warfare. Other vassal rebellions followed similar patterns. The Afghan nobles in the northwest, remembering their own claims to power, attempted coordinated uprisings. Akbar's response involved not just military defeat, but systematic humiliation of captured leaders. Some were forced to watch their families executed before their own deaths. Others were kept alive as examples, displayed in cages at the imperial court to remind visitors of rebellion's consequences. The emperor's political strategies during these campaigns revealed calculating intelligence behind the brutality. He would often spare one member of a rebellious family, usually a young heir, bringing them to court as both hostage and future loyal administrator. This created a new class of nobles, those who served not from loyalty but from terror of what happened to those who refused. These harsh reprisals succeeded in their immediate goal. Open rebellion became increasingly rare as news of Akbar's methods spread throughout the empire. However, they also created a deeper problem. The emperor had established a system built entirely on fear, where loyalty was maintained through terror rather than respect or genuine political alliance. The successful suppression of vassal rebellions marked a turning point in Akbar's reign. Having demonstrated his willingness to destroy anyone who challenged his authority, the young emperor now faced a different kind of threat: those who sought to eliminate him entirely rather than openly rebel. The seeds of future assassination attempts had been planted in the very brutality that secured his throne. Part 5. The assassination attempts, paranoia, and retribution. The whispered conspiracies began reaching Akbar's ears almost immediately after his bloody suppression of the rebellious vassals. Palace servants spoke in hushed tones about mysterious meetings in darkened chambers. Guards reported strange movements in the corridors at night. The emperor's spies brought disturbing news from across the empire. Powerful nobles who had witnessed his ruthless methods were now plotting something far more dangerous than open rebellion. The first serious attempt came in 1564, when Akbar was just 22 years old. A group of Rajput nobles, still seething over his harsh treatment of their kinsmen, hatched a plan to poison the emperor during a grand feast. They had recruited a cook in the royal kitchen, promising him gold and safe passage to distant lands. The plot might have succeeded, but one conspirator's wife, fearing for her own family's safety, revealed the scheme to imperial agents. Akbar's response was swift and merciless. The cook was tortured publicly before being executed. The nobles involved faced a fate that sent shockwaves through the court. They were trampled to death by war elephants as crowds watched in horrified silence. This first brush with assassination changed something fundamental in Akbar's mind. The young emperor, already suspicious from his violent rise to power, now saw potential killers everywhere. He began employing food tasters for every meal. His sleeping quarters were moved randomly each night. The number of guards around him doubled, then tripled. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford. The second attempt came 3 years later, orchestrated by a faction of Afghan nobles who had lost their lands during his early conquests. They planned to strike during Akbar's morning prayers, when he would be momentarily vulnerable and distracted. A hired assassin posed as a religious scholar, carrying a poisoned dagger hidden in his robes. Only the alertness of a loyal bodyguard prevented disaster. The man noticed the assassin's nervous behavior and unusual sweating. Under torture, the would-be killer revealed names that led to a widespread purge. Entire families connected to the plot disappeared overnight. Properties were confiscated. The message was clear. Plotting against the emperor meant not just your death, but the destruction of everyone you held dear. Each failed assassination attempt made Akbar more paranoid and more ruthless. He established an extensive network of spies who watched not just his enemies, but his friends and allies as well. Court officials found themselves under constant surveillance. Casual conversations were reported and analyzed for signs of disloyalty. The emperor's legendary tolerance for different religions and cultures began to look more like a calculated political strategy than genuine open-mindedness. By keeping various groups balanced against each other, none could unite effectively against him. The cycle of fear and retribution created a court atmosphere where everyone walked carefully, spoke cautiously, and trusted no one completely. Akbar had successfully protected himself from assassination, but in doing so, he had transformed his empire into a place where power flowed entirely through intimidation and where the emperor's survival depended on keeping everyone else afraid. Chapter 2: The Sword and the Crescent, Religious Wars and Devastation. Part 1: Campaign against Malwa, the Politicization of Faith. The drums of war echoed across the Deccan Plateau as Akbar's massive army marched toward Malwa in 1561. The young emperor, barely 19, had already proven his military skill. Now he faced a different challenge. Malwa's ruler Baz Bahadur controlled rich trade routes and fertile lands. But Akbar needed more than conquest to justify this campaign to his diverse empire. The emperor's court scribes worked tirelessly, crafting proclamations that painted this invasion as a holy war. They wrote of Baz Bahadur as an enemy of true faith, a ruler who had strayed from righteous Islamic governance. These documents spread through the empire's mosques, where Friday prayers now included calls for divine blessing on Akbar's righteous mission. The reality was simpler. Malwa's wealth and strategic position made it too valuable to ignore. Akbar's generals understood the game perfectly. They spoke of liberating Malwa's people from corrupt rule while privately dividing the kingdom's treasures among themselves. The emperor's closest advisors whispered of the need to demonstrate strength to other regional powers. Yet publicly, they declared this campaign a divine duty, ordained by Allah himself. The Sultan's court poets composed verses celebrating the coming victory over infidels and false Muslims alike. These songs traveled with the army, sung around campfires where soldiers sharpened their weapons. The men believed they fought for more than their emperor's ambition. They carried banners declaring their holy purpose, green flags bearing verses from the Quran fluttering above their heads. When the armies finally met near Sarangpur, religious fervor mixed with military strategy in deadly combination. Akbar's commanders shouted battle cries invoking divine justice while executing carefully planned tactical maneuvers. The soldiers charged believing God favored their cause, making them fight with desperate courage that broke Baz Bahadur's smaller force. Victory came swiftly, but the aftermath revealed the campaign's true nature. Akbar's treasury swelled with Malwa's gold, while his proclamations celebrated the triumph of righteous faith. The conquered territories provided new tax revenues and military recruitment grounds. Local nobles who submitted received positions in Akbar's administration, their loyalty secured through practical benefits rather than religious conversion. The emperor had learned a crucial lesson about power. Religion could transform naked ambition into noble purpose, making subjects willing to die for causes that ultimately serve the state's interests. This template would guide future campaigns, where political objectives consistently wore the mask of religious duty. As Akbar's armies consolidated control over Malwa, the emperor's reputation as both conqueror and faithful ruler spread throughout India. But beneath the religious rhetoric lay cold calculation, marking the beginning of a pattern that would define his reign through decades of expansion and conquest. Part 2. Chittorgarh Siege, Massacre at the Gates. The success in Malwa had proven religion's value as a political weapon, but nothing would test this formula like the great fortress of Chittorgarh. Rising from the Rajasthani desert like a stone mountain, Chittorgarh stood as more than just a military target. It represented the heart of Rajput resistance, a symbol that had defied Muslim rulers for centuries. For Akbar, capturing it meant breaking the spirit of an entire warrior culture. The siege began in October 1567, when Akbar's massive army surrounded the fortress. Unlike previous campaigns, where swift victory followed overwhelming force, Chittorgarh proved different. The Rajput defenders, led by Maharana Pratap's allies, refused to surrender despite facing certain death. They had witnessed what happened to those who submitted to Mughal rule. Watching their traditions slowly dissolve under foreign influence, Akbar grew increasingly frustrated as weeks turned to months. His engineers dug tunnels beneath the walls, while his cannons pounded the ancient stones day and night. The emperor himself supervised the assault, determined to make an example that would echo across India. He had built his reputation on swift, decisive victories that combined military might with political wisdom. This prolonged resistance threatened that carefully crafted image. Inside the fortress, women prepared for Jauhar, the ritual self-immolation that would deny the enemy the satisfaction of capture. Children, barely old enough to walk, carried messages between defenders. Old men, who could no longer hold swords, sharpened arrows and prepared boiling oil. The entire population had chosen death over surrender, creating a situation that left Akbar with only one option. When the walls finally cracked in February 1568, the emperor's orders were clear: no quarter would be given. What followed was not conquest, but extermination. Mughal soldiers poured through the breaches, killing every living person they encountered. Men, women, children, even animals fell to Mughal swords. The cobblestones ran red with blood, as entire families were butchered in their homes. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of unimaginable horror. Soldiers competed to see who could kill the most civilians. Holy men were dragged from temples and executed. Pregnant women were cut open. their unborn children displayed as trophies. The systematic nature of the killing revealed careful planning rather than battlefield fury. The massacre served multiple purposes beyond mere revenge. It demonstrated the price of resistance to other Rajput kingdoms, many of which quickly submitted rather than face Chittorgarh's fate. It also satisfied Akbar's Muslim nobles, who saw the slaughter as righteous punishment for infidels who dared oppose their emperor. But the victory came with unexpected consequences. The Rajput spirit, rather than breaking, hardened into permanent resistance. Maharana Pratap would spend his life fighting guerrilla wars against Mughal rule, inspiring generations of warriors who viewed compromise as betrayal. The emperor had won a fortress, but created an enemy that would never truly submit. The success at Chittorgarh established a new template for Akbar's future conquests, where religious justification would increasingly mask campaigns of unprecedented brutality and cultural destruction. Part 3. The Sacred Thread Weighed. Ritual humiliation of the defeated. The bodies were still warm when Akbar's ceremonies began. After every major victory, the emperor demanded more than simple surrender. He required theater, a public demonstration that would etch defeat deep into the souls of the conquered. The rituals that followed his conquests revealed a calculated cruelty designed to break not just armies, but entire cultures. At Chittorgarh, the survivors watched in horror as Mughal soldiers dragged their sacred symbols through mud and filth. Hindu priests were forced to remove their sacred threads, those thin cotton strands that marked their spiritual identity. These threads, worn across the chest since childhood, represented connection to the divine. Tearing them away was like ripping apart a man's soul. The priests wept as soldiers snapped the threads and trampled them underfoot, while laughing. Noble prisoners faced even worse humiliation. Rajput warriors who had spent lifetimes building honor found themselves forced to bow before Akbar's throne. But this was not mere submission. They had to place their turbans on the ground, symbols of their pride and lineage, while Islamic prayers echoed around them. Some chose death rather than endure this shame. Others, broken by the spectacle, complied and lived with the memory forever. Women of defeated royal families suffered particular degradation. Queens and princesses were paraded before Mughal nobles, their jewels and fine clothes replaced with servants' rags. They were made to serve water to the same soldiers who had killed their husbands and sons. The message was clear: your highest had fallen to our lowest. Religious artifacts became props in these cruel displays. Sacred statues were brought before crowds and smashed while their former worshippers watched helplessly. Temple bells, once calling faithful to prayer, were melted down to make chains for prisoners. Ancient manuscripts, containing centuries of wisdom, were burned in public squares as victory celebrations. Akbar himself often presided over these ceremonies, sitting motionless on his portable throne. His presence made the humiliation complete. This was not random violence by uncontrolled soldiers, but deliberate policy from the emperor himself. He understood that broken spirits stayed broken longer than broken armies. The psychological impact spread far beyond those directly involved. Word of these rituals traveled across India, creating a climate of terror that often made resistance collapse before battles even began. Local rulers heard stories of sacred threads torn away and temples desecrated. Many chose immediate surrender rather than risk such public shame. But Akbar's ritual humiliations achieved another purpose entirely. They satisfied his Islamic nobles and soldiers, who saw these acts as righteous punishment for those who refused to accept Muslim rule. The ceremonies became bonding experiences for the Mughal army, shared moments of religious triumph over infidels. These carefully orchestrated humiliations would become standard practice throughout Akbar's reign. Each conquest brought new opportunities to demonstrate the completeness of defeat. The emperor had discovered that destroying pride proved more effective than destroying lives. The conquered could rebuild their cities, but rebuilding their dignity took generations. Part 4. Plunder of Holy Cities, Destruction and Desecration. Fresh from humiliating his defeated enemies, Akbar turned his attention to their most sacred spaces. The emperor understood that breaking people's spirits required more than ritual shame. It demanded attacking the very heart of their faith. What followed were campaigns that deliberately targeted temples, monasteries, and holy sites across his expanding empire. When Akbar's armies marched into Gujarat in 1573, they did not simply conquer territory. They systematically destroyed Hindu and Jain temples that had stood for centuries. Soldiers smashed intricate stone carvings with hammers and pickaxes. They melted down golden idols to fill the imperial treasury. Ancient manuscripts written on palm leaves were burned in massive bonfires that lit the night sky for days. The assault on Somnath Temple became legendary among his troops. This sacred site had been rebuilt by devotees after previous invasions, symbolizing the resilience of Hindu faith. Akbar's soldiers tore down the temple walls stone by stone. They defaced sculptures of deities, chipping away faces and limbs until the figures became unrecognizable. The temple's priests were forced to watch as centuries of artistic achievement crumbled to dust. But destruction served purposes beyond mere conquest. Each demolished temple sent a clear message to local populations about the futility of resistance. When word spread that the emperor's armies had reduced sacred sites to rubble, other cities often surrendered without fighting. The psychological impact proved devastating. Communities that had gathered for generations around these holy places suddenly found themselves spiritually homeless. Akbar's soldiers developed efficient methods for temple destruction. They learned which architectural weak points would bring down structures fastest. Teams specialized in identifying and removing valuable materials before demolition began. Gold leaf was scraped from walls, precious stones pried from pillars, and bronze statues hauled away as war booty. The emperor himself rarely witnessed these destructions directly. He remained in his camps while trusted generals supervised the demolitions. This distance allowed him to maintain plausible deniability when meeting with Hindu nobles who might question his tolerance. Yet he personally approved each major temple destruction, signing orders that sealed the fate of countless sacred sites. Religious leaders who protested faced immediate consequences. Some were imprisoned, others executed as examples to their communities. The message became unmistakable. Challenging the emperor's religious policies meant risking death. This fear silenced many voices that might have spoken against the systematic destruction. The wealth extracted from these holy sites funded Akbar's future campaigns. Temple treasuries, accumulated through centuries of devotional offerings, now purchased weapons and paid soldiers' wages. Sacred gold became the currency of conquest. Each demolished temple literally financed the next phase of imperial expansion, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of destruction and plunder that would define this darker chapter of Mughal rule. Part 5. The Infidel Slayer, Akbar's Jihad and Forced Conversions. The plundered temples and humiliated priests were only the beginning. Behind closed palace doors, Akbar's court buzzed with discussions about converting the conquered populations. His advisors spoke in hushed tones about the religious duty of bringing the faithful into Islam's fold. What started as military conquest gradually transformed into something far more systematic. Local administrators received clear instructions from the imperial court. Hindu merchants and artisans found themselves facing impossible choices: convert to Islam or lose trading privileges, accept the new faith or watch business licenses disappear. The emperor's officials made these ultimatums seem like generous offers, but everyone understood the consequences of refusal. In Gujarat's conquered territories, entire communities faced organized pressure. Islamic scholars arrived in villages with imperial backing, delivering sermons that mixed theological arguments with barely concealed threats. Those who showed interest in conversion received immediate benefits: tax reductions, government positions, and protection from harassment. Those who remained steadfast in their original beliefs discovered that life became increasingly difficult. The most troubling accounts come from Rajputana's defeated regions. After military victories, Akbar's administrators established conversion centers in former Hindu strongholds. Local chronicles describe families torn apart, as some members chose Islam for survival while others refused. Children were separated from parents when one generation converted and another resisted. Court historians documented these campaigns with pride, describing Akbar as the slayer of infidels who brought divine light to darkened lands. Imperial records celebrated each conversion milestone as a religious victory. Letters between provincial governors reveal quotas, specific numbers of conversions expected from each district. Administrators who failed to meet these targets faced demotion or worse. The emperor's personal involvement in these campaigns remains documented in contemporary sources. He personally oversaw mass conversion ceremonies, lending imperial prestige to what local populations experienced as coercion. Persian chroniclers wrote glowing accounts of hundreds converting simultaneously, though they rarely mentioned the economic and social pressures that made these conversions inevitable. Resistance emerged in subtle forms. Some converts practiced their original religion secretly, while publicly following Islamic customs. Underground networks helped maintain old traditions despite official prohibition. But these acts of defiance carried enormous risks. Discovery meant accusations of apostasy, a charge that carried the death penalty under Islamic law. The human cost of these policies extended far beyond individual conversions. Communities that had existed for centuries fractured along religious lines. Ancient cultural practices disappeared as converts abandoned traditional festivals and customs. Sanskrit learning declined in regions where scholars faced pressure to embrace Arabic and Persian studies instead. These forced conversions created a foundation of resentment that would plague the Mughal Empire for generations. The systematic nature of the campaign contradicted later claims about Akbar's religious tolerance. The emperor, who would eventually experiment with his own syncretic faith, began his reign by implementing some of the most aggressive conversion policies in Indian history. The seeds of future rebellions were planted in these early years of religious coercion and cultural suppression. Chapter 3: Tyranny and State Control. The Price of Empire. Part 1: The Pyramid of Skulls. Executions after the Ahmedabad battle. The dust had barely settled on the battlefield near Ahmedabad when Emperor Akbar decided to send a message that would echo across his empire for generations. The year was 1573, and the Gujarati forces had dared to challenge Mughal authority. Their defeat was swift. But what followed would become one of the most chilling examples of how the supposedly tolerant emperor maintained his grip on power. As prisoners knelt in long rows under the scorching sun, Akbar gave orders that revealed the calculated brutality behind his reign. Every captured soldier, every nobleman who had opposed him, would face execution. But this would not be a simple matter of justice, or even revenge. This would be theater of the most horrifying kind. The executions began at dawn and continued for days. Swords fell with mechanical precision as hundreds of heads rolled into growing piles. But Akbar's commanders had specific instructions. The bodies were to be left where they fell, but the heads served a different purpose entirely. Workers began the grim task of construction, using human skulls as their building blocks. Stone by stone, skull by skull, a pyramid began to rise on the outskirts of Ahmedabad. The structure grew taller with each passing day, a monument built not from marble or sandstone, but from the remains of those who had dared to defy the Mughal throne. The smell of decay filled the air as the pyramid took shape, visible from miles away. Local residents were forced to witness this display. Merchants traveling the trade routes, farmers bringing goods to market, children playing in nearby fields, all could see Akbar's message written in bone and death. The pyramid stood as a constant reminder that opposition to the emperor carried the ultimate price. Court chroniclers carefully recorded the numbers. Some accounts speak of over 3,000 skulls forming the base of this gruesome monument. Others suggest the figure was even higher. What mattered was not the exact count, but the effect it had on anyone who saw it or heard the stories that spread like wildfire across the empire. The pyramid served multiple purposes in Akbar's calculations. It warned other regional rulers what fate awaited those who challenged Mughal authority. It satisfied his need for public vengeance against those who had cost him time, resources, and soldiers. Most importantly, it demonstrated that beneath the diplomatic facade and religious tolerance lay an emperor willing to use the most extreme measures to maintain control. Travelers passing through Ahmedabad months later still reported seeing the weathered remains of the skull pyramid, a permanent scar on the landscape that spoke to the darker methods behind Akbar's legendary empire building. Part 2: Retribution and Torture, Cruelty as Rule. The skull pyramid at Ahmedabad was merely the visible symbol of a much darker system that operated throughout Akbar's reign. Behind the grand proclamations of religious tolerance and administrative brilliance lay a network of terror designed to crush any hint of dissent before it could threaten the empire. The emperor's dungeons beneath Fatehpur Sikri became legendary among those unfortunate enough to learn of their existence. Here, suspected traitors faced interrogations that lasted for weeks. The methods were systematic and brutal. Red-hot iron rods pressed against flesh extracted confessions that may or may not have contained truth. The rack stretched limbs until joints separated with audible pops that echoed through the stone corridors. These were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully orchestrated procedures designed to break both body and spirit. Akbar personally approved many of these sessions. Court records show his signatures on orders for specific punishments. When a provincial governor was suspected of skimming taxes, the emperor ordered that molten lead be poured into his ears. The message was clear: even governors were not beyond reach. The screams from the torture chambers served as a constant reminder to courtiers that their comfortable positions depended entirely on imperial favor. The emperor's treatment of religious dissenters revealed another layer of his methodology. Despite his public stance on tolerance, those who actively opposed his policies faced systematic persecution. When a group of Orthodox Muslim clerics criticized his marriage alliances with Hindu Rajput families, they simply disappeared one night. Their fate became whispered legend, buried alive in the foundations of the new city being constructed. Whether true or not, the story served its purpose perfectly. Criminal justice under Akbar became theater designed to terrorize. Public executions in Delhi drew crowds who came not for entertainment, but because attendance was effectively mandatory. Local officials took note of who appeared and who stayed away. The methods varied according to the crime and the emperor's mood. Thieves lost hands in elaborate ceremonies. Murderers were trampled by elephants while crowds watched in horrified silence. Each death served as both punishment and warning. The torture system extended beyond political crimes to everyday governance. Tax collectors carried portable instruments of persuasion. Farmers who claimed crop failure might find themselves suspended upside down until blood pooled in their skulls. Merchants who shortchanged the imperial treasury discovered that their fingernails could be slowly removed with specially designed pliers. These methods ensured that revenue flowed steadily to the capital. This machinery of cruelty created an atmosphere where loyalty was born from fear rather than genuine respect. Courtiers smiled and bowed, knowing that a wrong word might lead to unimaginable suffering. The emperor's legendary temper was not just anger, but a calculated tool of statecraft. Every harsh punishment reinforced the message that opposition to Akbar's will brought consequences too terrible to contemplate. The most chilling aspect was how normalized this violence became. Court chronicles recorded tortures alongside architectural achievements and diplomatic victories. As if they were equally valid expressions of imperial power, this system of state-sponsored terror would soon extend its reach into the most private spaces of the empire, where even the emperor's own wives would discover the true cost of residing within the golden cage of power. Part 3. Exploitation and harems, the lives of women in the imperial palaces. Behind the marble walls of Agra's imperial palaces, a different kind of terror flourished. The emperor's harem housed hundreds of women from across the empire, each one trapped within an elaborate system of control that masked brutality with luxury. These women lived in golden prisons, their lives dictated by the emperor's needs and political calculations. Marriage had become Akbar's weapon of conquest. When he defeated a kingdom, he demanded the ruler's daughters as tribute. These forced unions sealed political alliances while humiliating defeated enemies. The women arrived at court as captives disguised as brides, their families powerless to refuse the emperor's demands. Hindu princesses, Muslim noblewomen, and daughters of tribal chiefs all found themselves collected like precious objects for the imperial household. The harem operated under suffocating restrictions. Women could never leave without permission, rarely granted except for carefully supervised outings. They lived under constant surveillance by eunuch guards, who reported their every conversation and movement. Letters to family required approval. Visitors faced strict limitations. The emperor controlled even their religious practices, forcing many to abandon their faith or practice in secret. Physical abuse remained commonplace despite the harem's opulent appearance. Women who displeased Akbar faced beatings, starvation, or confinement in dark cells. Some disappeared entirely, their fates never explained to other residents. The emperor's wives learned to hide bruises beneath silk garments and smile during public ceremonies while nursing private wounds. The system reduced women to breeding stock and political tools. Successful pregnancies brought temporary favor, while failure to produce heirs often meant disgrace. Mothers watched helplessly as their children became pawns in succession struggles. Sons faced potential execution if they threatened the crown prince, while daughters became currency for future political marriages. Competition poisoned relationships between wives and concubines. The emperor deliberately fostered jealousy by favoring different women at different times. This prevented alliances that might challenge his authority while keeping the women focused on pleasing him rather than plotting escape. Many descended into depression or madness, their spirits broken by years of captivity and manipulation. The most tragic cases involved child brides, some barely 12 years old when forced into marriage. These girls lost their childhood to an old man's political ambitions. Thrust into adult responsibilities they could barely comprehend. Their tears meant nothing to an emperor who saw them as investments in future loyalty from their families. Escape proved nearly impossible. The few women who attempted flight faced execution if caught, their deaths serving as warnings to others. Family members who helped faced similar punishment, ensuring that even blood relatives became reluctant allies in their captivity. This systematic oppression of women revealed the personal cost of Akbar's empire building. While chroniclers praised his diplomatic marriages as signs of tolerance and unity, they ignored the suffering of the women who paid the price for their ruler's ambitions. The harem's hidden cruelty would soon find its reflection in the emperor's treatment of entire populations through calculated economic oppression. Part 4. Imperial Taxation, the reintroduction and selective withdrawal of jizya. The calculated cruelty that marked Akbar's personal rule extended far beyond palace walls, into the very foundation of his empire's economy. Just as women served as political tools in his hands, entire religious communities became instruments of financial manipulation through the emperor's strategic use of the jizya tax. The jizya represented one of Islam's oldest traditions, a tax levied specifically on non-Muslim subjects. Previous Mughal rulers had imposed it with religious fervor, but Akbar transformed this ancient practice into something far more cynical, a weapon of economic control that he could raise or lower based purely on political need. When Akbar needed money for his endless military campaigns, the jizya would mysteriously reappear. Hindu merchants, Sikh farmers, and Christian traders found themselves facing crushing tax burdens that Muslim subjects never endured. The amounts were deliberately set high enough to cause real hardship. Families sold land, jewelry, and livestock to meet these demands. Some abandoned their ancestral homes entirely, fleeing to regions beyond Mughal control. The emperor's court historians painted these policies as examples of his religious tolerance, claiming he eventually abolished the jizya permanently. The reality proved far more complex and cruel. Akbar withdrew the tax publicly while maintaining dozens of other fees and levies that accomplished the same goal. Non-Muslim subjects still paid more than their Muslim neighbors, but the emperor could claim credit for his apparent generosity. Regional governors received clear instructions about implementation. In areas where non-Muslim populations held significant economic power, the jizya remained officially suspended to maintain stability. In regions where these communities lacked political influence, collection continued under different names. Local administrators called it protection fees or special levies, but the burden remained unchanged. This selective enforcement revealed the emperor's true priorities. Religious policy served economic and political goals, nothing more. When powerful Hindu Rajputs threatened rebellion, their subjects enjoyed tax relief. When isolated Christian communities complained, their burdens often increased. The emperor's supposed tolerance depended entirely on practical calculations of power and profit. Non-Muslim communities quickly learned to read these signals. Wealthy merchants began converting to Islam, not from religious conviction, but to escape crushing taxation. Others migrated to territories beyond Mughal reach, taking their skills and capital with them. The empire's economy suffered as talented artisans and traders fled, but Akbar continued the practice because it generated immediate revenue. The human cost proved enormous. Families destroyed by impossible tax demands, communities scattered by economic pressure, and a permanent atmosphere of uncertainty that poisoned relationships between religious groups. Akbar had created a system where faith determined financial survival, ensuring that religious identity became a source of constant economic anxiety. This calculated manipulation of religious taxation would establish patterns that lasted for generations. The emperor's successors inherited not just an empire, but a deeply embedded system of religious-based exploitation that would fuel centuries of resentment. As Akbar prepared to display his power through increasingly elaborate public spectacles, the foundation of economic oppression he had built would provide the wealth necessary to fund such grand demonstrations of imperial might. Part 5. Public displays of power, statues, trials, and spectacles. The wealth extracted through religious taxation now flowed into Akbar's grandest weapon of control: spectacular public displays designed to remind every subject of their place beneath his throne. The emperor understood that true power required not just the ability to crush opposition, but the theater to make that crushing visible to all. In the grand courtyards of Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar orchestrated trials that were less about justice and more about performance. Accused nobles and officials found themselves brought before massive crowds, their fate decided not in private chambers, but under the scorching sun, where thousands could witness imperial judgment. The emperor would sit elevated on his throne, surrounded by glittering courtiers, while the accused stood in chains below. These weren't legal proceedings, but carefully choreographed demonstrations of absolute authority. The sentences delivered in these public spectacles often shocked even seasoned observers. Minor infractions received brutal punishments, while the emperor's explanations for his decisions became lessons in submission. Guards would drag condemned men away as crowds watched in silence, understanding that any one of them could occupy that position tomorrow. The message was unmistakable. Akbar's mercy was a gift, and his wrath was certain. Beyond the courtrooms, the emperor commissioned massive stone elephants and towering pillars that dominated city squares across his empire. These monuments weren't just artistic expressions, but psychological weapons. Citizens conducting daily business found themselves dwarfed by carved representations of imperial power, constant reminders of who controlled their lives. Local craftsmen were forced to abandon their own projects to work on these displays, their livelihoods redirected toward glorifying their ruler. Religious festivals became opportunities for Akbar to insert his authority into sacred spaces. Hindu celebrations, Muslim holy days, and Christian gatherings all found themselves transformed into showcases of imperial presence. The emperor would appear at these events with elaborate processions, his guards clearing paths through worshipping crowds. What should have been spiritual moments became political theater, with Akbar positioning himself as the earthly power that permitted such gatherings to exist. Perhaps most chilling were the punishment ceremonies held in public markets. Thieves, tax evaders, and political dissidents faced their sentences before crowds of merchants and shoppers. The screams of those being tortured mixed with the sounds of commerce, creating an atmosphere where economic activity occurred alongside state violence. Children playing in these squares grew up watching public beatings, learning early that defiance brought suffering. These displays achieved their intended effect. Rivals who might have challenged Akbar's rule found themselves isolated as potential supporters recognized the terrible consequences of backing the wrong side. The emperor's subjects developed a practiced indifference to brutality, their daily lives structured around avoiding imperial attention. As word of these spectacles spread beyond the empire's borders, neighboring kingdoms began to recalculate their diplomatic approaches. Akbar's reputation for combining cultural sophistication with merciless cruelty created a complex international image that would influence regional politics for decades. The next phase of his reign would reveal how this carefully cultivated atmosphere of fear enabled even more systematic forms of oppression. Chapter 4: Cloak of Tolerance, Ambiguities and Self-Serving Pluralism. Part 1: The Abadat Khana, Debates Amidst Suppression. In the year 1575, Akbar built a special hall called the Abadat Khana within the walls of Fatehpur Sikri. This house of worship became the stage for something remarkable yet troubling. Every Thursday evening, as the sun set over the Mughal capital, scholars from different faiths would gather to debate the deepest questions of existence, faith, and truth. The hall buzzed with animated discussions between Muslim clerics, Hindu pandits, Christian priests, Jewish rabbis, and Zoroastrian scholars. Akbar himself would sit on his elevated throne, listening intently as these learned men argued about the nature of God, the path to salvation, and the meaning of Scripture. The emperor appeared fascinated by these exchanges, often asking probing questions that pushed the debates deeper. But this apparent openness masked a darker reality. While Akbar welcomed certain religious voices into his court, he simultaneously crushed others who dared to challenge his authority. The same emperor who listened patiently to Christian missionaries had Orthodox Muslim scholars imprisoned or exiled when they questioned his religious innovations. The Abadat Khana became less a forum for genuine religious inquiry and more a carefully controlled theater where Akbar could display his power over all faiths. The debates served a calculated purpose. By bringing religious leaders together under his direct supervision, Akbar positioned himself as the supreme arbiter of religious truth. He encouraged disagreements between the scholars, watching as they undermined each other's positions. When Muslim clerics couldn't agree among themselves about basic theological questions, Akbar would step in to suggest that perhaps divine guidance came through him instead. The emperor's most revealing moment came when he declared himself the final judge in all religious disputes. This wasn't tolerance, but control. The scholars who participated willingly became part of his system, while those who refused faced consequences. Some religious leaders found their communities pressured, their followers harassed, or their places of worship restricted. The Christian priest, Father Montserrat, who attended these sessions, later wrote about the strange atmosphere. He noted how Akbar would praise Christianity one day, then mock its core beliefs the next. The emperor wasn't seeking truth, but testing loyalties and gathering intelligence about his subjects' deepest convictions. The most troubling aspect was how these intellectual exercises coexisted with harsh policies outside the hall. While debates about religious harmony filled the evenings, Akbar's administrators continued implementing discriminatory taxes and regulations against certain communities. The gap between the lofty discussions and daily realities revealed the emperor's true priorities. These Thursday gatherings ultimately became tools of statecraft rather than genuine religious discourse. Akbar had created an illusion of openness while maintaining absolute control over religious expression throughout his empire. Part 2: Sulh-i-Kul and the Politics of Universal Peace. Building upon the deceptive nature of the Ibadat-Khana debates, Akbar's most celebrated achievement emerged as an equally complex political maneuver. The doctrine of Sulh-i-Kul, often translated as universal peace or peace with all, became the emperor's master stroke in managing his vast empire's religious diversity. What appeared to be enlightened tolerance was actually a carefully crafted system of control wrapped in the language of harmony. Akbar promoted this doctrine as his personal philosophy after witnessing years of religious conflicts that threatened imperial stability. The basic principle seems simple. All religions contained elements of truth, and subjects should be free to practice their faith without interference. The emperor presented himself as a benevolent ruler who had risen above sectarian divisions to embrace a higher spiritual understanding. The reality behind Sulh-i-Kul revealed a more calculated purpose. This policy served as a brilliant administrative tool that allowed Akbar to maintain authority over his empire's Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, and other religious communities without favoring any single group. By positioning himself as the neutral arbiter of religious truth, he avoided the dangerous game of choosing sides in sectarian disputes. The emperor's court historians and chroniclers worked tirelessly to promote this image of religious harmony. They recorded numerous examples of Akbar's supposed tolerance. His marriages to Hindu princesses, appointments of non-Muslims to high positions, and public displays of respect for various religious traditions. These accounts created a powerful narrative that masked the more troubling aspects of his reign. However, the implementation of Sulh-i-Kul often contradicted its stated principles. While the doctrine preached acceptance, Akbar continued selective persecution of religious groups that threatened his political interests. The emperor showed remarkable tolerance toward faiths that posed no challenge to his authority, while maintaining harsh policies against those who questioned his supremacy. The most revealing aspect of this universal peace was its flexibility. Akbar could invoke religious tolerance when it served his purposes, such as gaining Hindu support or impressing foreign visitors. Conversely, he could quietly abandon these principles when dealing with rebellious Muslim nobles or resistant local populations who refused to accept Mughal rule. The doctrine also served as a shield against criticism from various religious establishments. When Islamic scholars questioned his policies, Akbar could point to his inclusive approach as evidence of his commitment to peace. When Hindu leaders raised concerns, he could highlight his protection of their temples and customs. This strategic ambiguity allowed him to maintain support from multiple constituencies simultaneously. The true genius of Sulh-i-Kul lay in how it transformed religious diversity from an imperial weakness into a strength. Rather than trying to convert his subjects or impose uniformity, Akbar created a system where different groups felt they had a stake in the empire's success. This approach reduced religious rebellions and created a more stable foundation for Mughal rule. Yet this stability came at a cost that few recognized at the time. The doctrine of universal peace gradually transformed genuine religious conviction into political performance, where faith became secondary to imperial loyalty. Part 3. Sati outlawed, burqa remains, selective reforms for calculated gain. Akbar's approach to social reform revealed the calculating mind of a ruler who understood that selective change could secure greater political advantage than wholesale transformation. When he banned the practice of sati in 1582, declaring that no woman should be forced to burn herself on her husband's funeral pyre, the emperor appeared to champion women's rights and humane governance. The decision earned him praise from various quarters and reinforced his image as an enlightened monarch who stood above the cruel customs of his subjects. Yet this same ruler who saved women from the flames continued to enforce the strict practice of veiling, particularly the burqa, which kept women hidden from public view and restricted their movement throughout society. The contradiction was deliberate rather than accidental. Akbar recognized that outlawing sati would cost him little politically, while gaining significant moral capital, especially among groups already questioning the practice's religious validity. The burqa, however, served different political purposes that made its elimination far more dangerous to his rule. The practice had deep roots in both Islamic tradition and local custom, creating a web of expectations that bound together powerful religious authorities, traditional families, and conservative communities. Challenging this custom would have sparked resistance from the very groups whose support kept his empire stable. Akbar's advisors understood the mathematics of reform. Banning sati primarily affected Hindu widows, a group with limited political voice, while appealing to Islamic sensibilities about protecting life. Maintaining veiling practices satisfied Islamic authorities, while reassuring conservative elements across religious lines that the emperor would not disrupt all traditional social structures. The emperor's selective approach extended beyond women's issues into broader social customs. He restricted child marriage in some contexts, while permitting it in others. He promoted education for certain groups while leaving vast populations in traditional ignorance. Each decision followed the same pattern: reform where it strengthened his position, maintain tradition where change threatened his support base. This calculated selectivity served Akbar's larger political strategy of appearing progressive without actually threatening existing power structures. Religious leaders could point to his preservation of key customs when questioned by conservative followers, while progressive elements could celebrate his humanitarian reforms. The emperor successfully positioned himself as both protector of tradition and agent of enlightened change. The real beneficiaries of this approach were neither the women saved from sati nor those kept behind veils, but rather Akbar himself and the imperial system that required delicate balance between competing interests. His reforms created the appearance of moral leadership, while his restraint preserved the social hierarchies that kept his diverse empire manageable. This pragmatic calculation would define much of his religious and cultural policy, as the emperor consistently chose political benefit over consistent principle in shaping the society he ruled. Part 4. The Fate of Temples. Patronage, plunder, and political expediency. The same calculating mind that outlawed sati while preserving the burqa would soon reveal itself in Akbar's approach to Hindu temples. Across the Mughal Empire, sacred spaces told conflicting stories of imperial policy, where divine architecture became pawns in a larger political game. In Vrindavan, the emperor's coins flowed freely to support temple construction. Hindu priests praised his generosity as they watched marble columns rise and intricate carvings take shape under imperial patronage. Akbar personally visited these sites, offering prayers and donations that delighted local populations. News of such gestures spread through Hindu communities, painting him as a ruler who truly respected their faith. Yet barely 100 miles away, different temples faced entirely different fates. Imperial armies arrived at wealthy temple complexes with orders that contradicted the Vrindavan example entirely. Soldiers stripped gold ornaments from deity statues and loaded precious stones into royal coffers. Some structures were demolished completely, their materials repurposed for imperial construction projects. The pattern became clear to those who looked closely. Temples in politically sensitive regions received generous patronage, particularly where local Hindu rulers had recently submitted to Mughal authority. These acts of religious respect served as visible proof that cooperation with the empire brought rewards. Local populations witnessed their emperor honoring their gods, creating loyalty that armies alone could never achieve. Conversely, temples in rebellious areas or those controlled by defiant local rulers faced destruction or plunder. The message was equally clear. Resistance to imperial authority would not be tolerated, even in sacred spaces. Akbar's forces targeted these religious centers not out of theological hatred, but as strategic strikes against political opponents who used temples as rallying points for resistance. The emperor's court carefully managed these contradictory policies. Official chronicles emphasized temple patronage while downplaying destruction, creating a narrative of universal tolerance. Hindu courtiers received positions and honors that validated this story, becoming living examples of imperial magnanimity. Meanwhile, military reports on temple raids were buried in administrative files, classified as routine security operations rather than religious persecution. This dual approach extended beyond mere political calculation. Wealthy temples represented economic prizes worth substantial sums in gold, silver, and precious gems. Plundering these resources filled imperial treasuries while weakening potential centers of political resistance. The same temple that might receive patronage in peacetime could face destruction during rebellion, depending entirely on political circumstances rather than religious principle. Regional governors learned to read these signals carefully. They understood that temple policy reflected imperial priorities more than spiritual beliefs. A governor who patronized temples in a stable region while destroying them in rebellious territories would receive praise for both actions, provided each served imperial interests effectively. This pragmatic inconsistency would define much of Akbar's religious legacy, where sacred spaces became instruments of statecraft rather than expressions of genuine faith. The emperor's treatment of temples revealed the true nature of his tolerance, a flexible tool shaped by political necessity rather than spiritual conviction, preparing the ground for even more calculated religious manipulations to come. Part 5. Machiavellian Alliances, Pragmatic Rather Than Altruistic Secularism. When Akbar forged alliances with Rajput kings, Christian missionaries, and Sikh gurus, his court historians painted these partnerships as evidence of his noble, tolerant spirit. The reality was far more calculating. Each religious alliance served a specific strategic purpose, carefully designed to strengthen his grip on power while neutralizing potential threats. The emperor's famous marriage to Hindu princess Jodha exemplified this approach. Rather than expressing genuine respect for Hindu traditions, the union secured crucial Rajput military support. Akbar needed their cavalry and their knowledge of local terrain. In return, he allowed certain Hindu practices at court, and appointed Rajput nobles to key positions. But these concessions came with strings attached. The Hindu allies had to prove their loyalty repeatedly, often by suppressing rebellions in their own territories. Christian missionaries received similar treatment. When Portuguese priests arrived seeking converts, Akbar welcomed them warmly and even attended their sermons. He encouraged debates between Christians and Muslims, appearing fascinated by theological discussions. However, his real interest lay in European military technology and trade connections. The priests provided valuable intelligence about Portuguese naval power and access to advanced weaponry. When their usefulness diminished, so did his enthusiasm for their message. Akbar's approach to Sikh leaders followed the same pattern. He granted land to Guru Ram Das and supported the construction of the Golden Temple. This gesture appeared magnanimous, but it served to win over Punjab's growing Sikh population and secure the empire's northwestern frontier. The emperor understood that religious minorities, when properly managed, could become valuable allies against more dangerous enemies. The most revealing aspect of these alliances was their conditional nature. Hindu nobles who questioned imperial policies found their privileges revoked. Christian missionaries who pushed too hard for conversions were quietly expelled. Sikh leaders who showed independence faced immediate pressure. Akbar maintained detailed records of each group's contributions to imperial goals, treating religious communities like business partners whose contracts required constant renewal. His famous religious tolerance became a sophisticated protection racket. Communities that demonstrated loyalty through military service, tax collection, or intelligence gathering received imperial favor. Those who hesitated faced subtle but unmistakable consequences. Local officials understood this dynamic perfectly, adjusting their treatment of religious groups based on their current standing with the emperor. This system created an illusion of harmony while masking deep-seated tensions. Different religious communities competed for imperial attention, often undermining each other to gain advantage. Akbar encouraged this competition, knowing it prevented any single group from becoming too powerful or independent. The emperor's religious policies thus revealed themselves as masterful political theater. Each alliance, each gesture of tolerance, each interfaith dialogue served the primary goal of imperial consolidation. True believers in different faiths found themselves pawns in a larger game where spiritual conviction mattered less than strategic value. This calculated manipulation would soon extend even further. As Akbar prepared to create his own synthetic religion designed to position himself as the ultimate spiritual authority. Chapter 5: Legacy of Shadows, Consequences, Revisionism, and Contested Memory. Part 1: Long-Term Scars, Popular Resistance and Rajput Honor. The wounds from Akbar's conquests ran deeper than most historians care to admit, especially among the Rajput clans who found their ancient codes of honor trampled beneath imperial ambition. While court chroniclers celebrated diplomatic marriages and administrative brilliance, the reality on the ground told a different story of broken pride and simmering resistance. The Rajputs had lived by strict codes for centuries. Their honor meant everything, more valuable than life itself. When Akbar demanded submission, he asked them to abandon the very principles that defined their existence. The marriage alliances that historians praise as diplomatic genius felt like betrayal to many Rajput families. They watched their daughters become political pawns, sent to Mughal harems not for love or even respect, but as symbols of defeat. Rana Pratap of Mewar became the voice of this wounded pride. While other Rajput rulers bent the knee, he chose exile and guerrilla warfare over submission. His resistance lasted decades, the constant reminder that Akbar's empire rested on force, not genuine acceptance. Even after Pratap's death, his example inspired others. The hills of Rajasthan echoed with stories of honor preserved through sacrifice. The psychological impact went beyond individual rulers. Entire communities watched their traditional systems crumble under imperial pressure. Local customs gave way to Mughal practices. Ancient temples faced restrictions, while new monuments celebrated the conqueror's glory. The very landscape began to reflect foreign dominance rather than local heritage. Akbar's policy of relocating defeated nobles to distant provinces scattered traditional power structures like dust in the wind. Rajput warriors found themselves governing Bengali districts, cut off from ancestral lands and support networks. This displacement bred resentment that passed from father to son, creating generational opposition to Mughal rule. The emperor's religious experiments added another layer of grievance. His divine faith, meant to bridge differences, seemed to many Rajputs like an attempt to erase their Hindu identity entirely. They had already sacrificed political independence. Now their spiritual traditions faced similar threats. The accumulated weight of these losses created deep wells of anger that would surface repeatedly in future generations. Even those Rajputs who served the empire faithfully carried internal conflicts. They enjoyed wealth and position, but struggled with the knowledge that their ancestors would have died rather than bow to foreign rulers. This tension between pragmatic survival and inherited honor created a complex legacy of collaboration mixed with quiet rebellion. The scars from Akbar's reign would influence Rajput behavior for centuries. Every subsequent Mughal emperor would face the same underlying problem. Military conquest could secure territory, but it could never truly conquer hearts hardened by historical grievance. These wounds would prove especially significant when later rulers abandoned Akbar's relatively tolerant policies, transforming simmering resentment into open revolt. Part 2. The Reign of Aurangzeb. Tolerance's short life and tyranny's return. When Akbar's son Jahangir ascended the throne in 1605, the empire's delicate balance of tolerance began to show cracks. Unlike his father, Jahangir lacked the deep philosophical commitment to religious harmony. He maintained most of Akbar's policies through inertia rather than conviction, allowing the framework of tolerance to survive, but without its passionate guardian. Shah Jahan continued this gradual drift away from his grandfather's ideals. Though he built the Taj Mahal as a monument to love, his reign witnessed increased pressure on Hindu traditions. Temple construction slowed, and Islamic law gained prominence in court decisions. The seeds of intolerance, carefully suppressed under Akbar, began sprouting in the empire's administrative soil, but it was Aurangzeb's ascension in 1658 that truly revealed how fragile Akbar's vision had always been. The new emperor possessed neither his great-grandfather's curiosity about other faiths nor his pragmatic understanding of diversity's political value. Where Akbar had seen strength in inclusion, Aurangzeb saw weakness in compromise. Within years of taking power, Aurangzeb systematically dismantled the tolerance structure Akbar had built. The jizya tax on non-Muslims returned with crushing force. Hindu festivals faced restrictions, and temple destruction became state policy. The Din-e-Ilahi disappeared entirely, remembered only as a curious historical footnote. The Rajput wounds that Akbar's reign had created now burst open with devastating consequences. Those proud clans who had swallowed their honor to serve the Mughals found themselves facing renewed persecution. The careful balance of respect and submission that Akbar had maintained crumbled into outright oppression. Rajput loyalty, already strained by generations of internal conflict, finally snapped. Maratha resistance, which had simmered quietly during the tolerant decades, exploded into full rebellion under Shivaji. The Hindu populations that Akbar had pacified through inclusion now faced the same choice their ancestors had confronted: submit to Islamic rule or fight for survival. Many chose war. Aurangzeb's reign lasted nearly 50 years, giving him ample time to undo his predecessor's work. Every policy reversal validated the critics who had always questioned Akbar's methods. The emperor, who had once boasted of winning hearts through wisdom, was posthumously proven wrong by his descendant who chose force over persuasion. The irony cut deep into history's judgment. Akbar's tolerance had been dismissed as weakness, his inclusivity as political calculation. But Aurangzeb's return to orthodox policies revealed the true fragility of conquest based purely on military might. The empire that had seemed invincible under Akbar began fracturing under the weight of renewed religious conflict. As rebellions multiplied across the subcontinent, one truth became clear. Akbar's vision had been both revolutionary and doomed. His attempt to build lasting unity through tolerance required successors with equal commitment to diversity. Instead, he left an empire to rulers who preferred the simplicity of oppression to the complexity of inclusion. Part 3. Reappraisals and Nationalist Mythmaking. The Battle for Akbar's Reputation. The collapse of Aurangzeb's empire in the early 18th century forced historians to reconsider Akbar's legacy, but their conclusions would be shaped as much by contemporary politics as historical evidence. When British colonial scholars first examined Mughal records, they found in Akbar a convenient figure who supported their narrative of enlightened foreign rule. Here was a Muslim emperor who had supposedly transcended religious bigotry, much like the British claimed to do. Colonial historians painted Akbar as the exception that proved the rule about Islamic intolerance, a lone beacon of reason in centuries of darkness. This British interpretation served clear political purposes. By celebrating Akbar's tolerance while condemning his successor's orthodoxy, colonial writers justified their own presence as civilizing forces. They argued that only foreign rule could bring stability to a subcontinent torn by religious conflict. Akbar became their ideal ruler, reasonable and pragmatic, unlike the supposedly fanatical Muslim kings who followed him. This version of history conveniently ignored the violence and coercion that had marked Akbar's actual reign. The rise of Indian nationalism in the 20th century created new pressures on Akbar's reputation. Hindu nationalist historians faced a dilemma when confronting this Mughal emperor. Some chose to attack him as a foreign invader who had destroyed indigenous traditions and forced conversions through cunning rather than outright violence. They pointed to the destruction of temples, the displacement of local rulers, and the gradual erosion of Hindu practices under Mughal influence. For these scholars, Akbar's tolerance was merely a facade hiding systematic oppression. Other nationalist writers took the opposite approach, claiming Akbar as a truly Indian ruler who had adopted local customs and created the genuinely inclusive empire. They emphasized his marriage to Rajput princesses, his interest in Hindu philosophy, and his creation of the syncretic Din-e-Ilahi. These historians argued that Akbar had transcended his foreign origins to become authentically Indian, offering a model for modern secular governance. Meanwhile, Pakistani historians developed their own competing narrative. Some celebrated Akbar as a great Muslim conqueror who had established Islamic rule across the subcontinent. Others criticized him for abandoning proper Islamic principles and diluting the faith with Hindu influences. These debates reflected contemporary tensions about Pakistan's identity as both an Islamic state and heir to Mughal civilization. Modern scholarship has revealed how political agendas have consistently distorted Akbar's historical image. Secular historians have emphasized his tolerance to support arguments for religious pluralism. Religious conservatives have highlighted his authoritarian tendencies to warn against unchecked state power. Regional politicians have claimed him as a local hero or condemned him as an oppressor, depending on their electoral needs. The truth about Akbar remains caught between these competing mythologies. Each generation has reshaped his legacy to serve contemporary purposes, making it nearly impossible to separate the historical figure from the political symbol. As scholars continue to debate his true nature, one fact remains clear. Akbar's reputation says as much about modern politics as it does about medieval history. Part 4. The Human Cost. Lasting Impacts on Populations and Traditions. Behind the grand narratives of religious tolerance and imperial glory lay a different reality. Akbar's reign transformed millions of lives across the subcontinent. often in ways that would echo through generations. The human price of building an empire was paid by ordinary people whose stories rarely made it into court chronicles. The emperor's military campaigns devastated entire regions. When Akbar conquered Gujarat in 1573, thousands of families fled their ancestral homes. Farmers lost their lands to Mughal administrators. Merchants saw their trade routes disrupted by new taxation systems. Local craftsmen found themselves competing with imperial workshops that enjoyed royal patronage. The ripple effects touched every corner of society. Religious communities faced particular pressures despite Akbar's reputation for tolerance. While he engaged with different faiths intellectually, his administration systematically weakened traditional religious structures. Hindu temples lost their land grants when Mughal officials redistributed properties. Local priests found their authority diminished as Akbar promoted his own religious experiments. Muslim clerics who opposed his innovations faced exile or worse. The social fabric of rural communities unraveled under imperial pressure. Akbar's revenue system demanded cash payments rather than grain, forcing farmers into market economies they barely understood. When harvests failed, families sold their children into slavery to pay taxes. Villages that had governed themselves for centuries suddenly answered to distant bureaucrats who spoke different languages and followed unfamiliar customs. Women bore unique burdens during this transformation. Rajput families, pressured into marriage alliances with the Mughals, sent their daughters to Agra as symbols of submission. These young women left behind their communities, languages, and gods to serve imperial politics. Their sacrifice bought temporary peace for their clans, but at enormous personal cost. Artisan communities experienced both opportunities and losses. While some craftsmen prospered under imperial patronage, others watched their traditional skills become obsolete. The standardization of weights, measures, and coinage helped trade but destroyed local practices that had sustained communities for generations. Master craftsmen found themselves competing with mass production techniques introduced by the imperial workshops. Indigenous populations faced the most severe disruptions. Forest communities lost access to traditional hunting grounds as Mughal administrators claimed royal forests. Tribal leaders who resisted were branded as rebels and faced military suppression. Ancient practices of shifting cultivation were banned as the empire imposed fixed agricultural boundaries. The demographic impact was staggering. Historian estimates suggest that regions under direct Mughal control experienced population declines during Akbar's early conquests. Disease, warfare, and displacement took their toll on communities that had lived in relative stability for centuries. Recovery took decades, and many traditional settlements never regained their former prosperity. These human costs reveal the gap between imperial ideology and lived reality. While Akbar's court celebrated cultural synthesis, common people struggled to adapt to rapid changes imposed from above. Their resilience allowed many communities to survive, but the scars of imperial transformation remained visible long after Akbar's death, setting the stage for future conflicts that would test the empire's stability. Part 5. The Unraveling of an Empire. Seeds of Collapse in Akbar's Reign. The empire Akbar built appeared mighty from the outside, but deep cracks ran through its foundation. These hidden weaknesses would eventually bring down the greatest dynasty India had ever seen. The emperor's tolerant policies created a dangerous balancing act. While Akbar courted Hindu nobles and allowed religious freedom, Orthodox Muslims felt betrayed. They watched their ruler bow to Hindu customs and marry Hindu wives. Some whispered that their emperor had abandoned Islam entirely. This religious divide created two competing factions within the court itself. Akbar's military campaigns had stretched the empire too thin. Constant warfare drained the royal treasury faster than taxes could refill it. The emperor needed money to pay his massive army, maintain his lavish court, and fund endless construction projects. Heavy taxation crushed farmers and merchants alike. Many regions that had once prospered under local rulers now struggled under imperial demands. The vast size of the empire made effective control nearly impossible. Communication between Delhi and distant provinces took months. Local governors often acted like independent kings, collecting taxes for themselves and ignoring imperial orders. Some regions remained loyal only as long as Akbar's armies stayed nearby. The moment troops moved elsewhere, rebellion would spark. The emperor's policy of religious tolerance had created an illusion of unity. Hindu nobles served alongside Muslim commanders, but underneath lay deep mistrust. Each group suspected the other of plotting against them. Regional identities remained strong. Rajputs still remembered their lost independence. Bengali merchants resented Mughal interference in their trade routes. Akbar's system depended entirely on his personal authority. He had created no lasting institutions that could survive his death. The empire worked because people feared and respected him individually. Without his commanding presence, the careful balance he maintained between competing interests would collapse. The economic foundation showed serious strain. Agricultural productivity had not increased to match the empire's growing needs. Trade routes brought wealth, but most profits flowed to the imperial court rather than enriching local communities. Artisans and farmers worked harder but earned less under imperial taxation than they had under their previous rulers. Cultural tensions simmered beneath the surface of Akbar's celebrated synthesis. While the court celebrated Hindu-Muslim harmony, ordinary people often lived in separate communities. Forced relocations and military settlements had disrupted traditional social patterns. Many communities felt like strangers in their own lands. The empire's military strength masked internal weakness. Akbar's army could crush external enemies and suppress rebellions, but it could not create genuine loyalty. Fear kept the empire together, not love or shared purpose. Soldiers fought for pay, not patriotism. These contradictions would prove fatal to Akbar's legacy. His successors inherited an empire that looked powerful but rested on unstable ground. The very policies that had made Akbar great would become sources of conflict after his death. The stage was set for the slow dissolution of Mughal power.